on sabbatical to found a think tank in January, and we're now 10 months of the way through that process. We did our first event at the end of January in London, second event a couple of days later in DC, and here we are, other end of the year. We've done close on 50 events in 3 cities now, London, New York, and DC. We've done a remarkable amount for a think tank, which has cost somewhere in the region of $3,500. We've got 60 plus global fellows, one of whom you're about to be introduced to. And we exist to look at the big issues of the 21st century. For those who might be wondering, in answer to the obvious question, I broke my neck covering the civil war in Sri Lanka for Reuters 9 years ago, which is why I now fly a wheelchair and travel very slowly around the world. I will be coming back to Reuters as a global affairs columnist early next year, and I'll be rebasing to Manhattan. So hopefully this will be the first of many interesting discussions here. For a first discussion, I thought we would start with the big war of the year, the ISIS war. We're going to talk about Iraq to a slightly lesser extent, and we're just going to take a look at where that conflict's going. And we've got one of the best panels we've assembled so far for this kind of topic. We have Ned Parker on my right, former Reuters bureau chief in Baghdad, who came back to the US in the middle of this year after writing some very good stories that upset some quite violent people. I'll leave him to kind of tell you the full background on that, but suffice to say, one of our very best journalists, now an enterprise reporter for Reuters out of here, and doing all manner of interesting stuff, again, mainly on the Middle East. Nelly Lahoud, specialist at the Countering Terrorism Center. Combating terrorists, sorry, US Army combating, none of this countering. Some countering. All about a seriously good expert on Islamic militancy, whether it's Al-Qaeda flavored, ISIS flavored, or other acronym flavored. Asher Castlebury, incoming global fellow at the Project State of the 21st Century, former US Army officer, not retired was how someone described it earlier, but I refuse to believe that people who are younger than me are allowed to retire. So we'll refer to him as a former Army officer, still a reservist, was deployed last year, firstly in Kuwait with the embassy there, but then into Baghdad to help counter ISIS, and didn't she do well? I wanted to start by firstly say that we're on the record and being live streamed at the moment. We will take it off the record midway through, not least because we tend to find some people would rather make comments off the record, and it's really good to be able to combine the two. I mean, Ned, let's look at Iraq first. I mean, ISIS really went on the offensive, 18 months ago now, beginning of 2000. Winning now.
And I think you could call it a stalemate. I mean, it's what in Iraq at least. Beiji, the area around Beiji was taken back last week.
Beiji being
in northern Iraq, in northern Saladin province, home to a major refinery that's been destroyed. And after, 14, 15 months of combats now in Iraqi militia and military hands. How long that lasts, who's to say? But regardless, large sections of the country in the north and the west remain firmly in the Islamic State's hands, and there's nothing to see a tipping point that causes them to see those vast spots of territory, not even talking about Syria.
Asher, how does that fit with your kind of perspective on it? Are we at a tipping point, or are we just in kind of stasis?
Well, more stasis. I would say that you're right as far as area, which is a big point, a strategic location in terms of oil revenue for the Iraqis, and also trying to regain the Ramadi area, which the Iraqis lost over the summer. It was a big issue at that time as far as criticizing on President Obama's strategy in Iraq. But this is all based on Iraqis' time and their pace, not the U.S. and everybody else. So, and that may take a long time, like what General Odenero says, this might be 10 to 15 years. And the U.S. or the coalition itself is is just there to support it on a limited basis. So if you look at it from a long-term perspectives, you're allowing Iraqis to take its time into regaining their country.
This is a much more kind of organic, let the Iraq war go where it will kind of approach, and eventually, hopefully, we'll end up in the right place.
Yes, the biggest surge will be actually taking back Mosul, which is a big thing that the Iraqis need to take back in order to claim victory over Daesh.
How does ISIS compare to the sort of groups we were looking at 5-10 years ago, the more traditional Al-Qaeda in Iraq? It's a different kind of beast, right? It's a somewhat different kind of beast.
It is clearly different, even though, to describe IS, for example, one would not be mistaken to say that it is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda did admit the Iraq-based group at the end of 2004. But we know from internal sources to Al-Qaeda that there was always a tension between the two groups. And one of the main tensions is that we know that a long time ago, as early as 1999, the leader of the Iraq-based group, when he met bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri in Afghanistan, he always had his intention of establishing an Islamic State, whereas Al-Qaeda was never in the business of actually establishing a state. Al-Qaeda was the anti-establishment, whereas that group was always on its mind to establish a state. And in fact, al-Zarqawi's successor established the state back in 2006 when he declared the Islamic State of Iraq. For a very long time, that all regional jihadi groups that, thinking there was such a thing as being Al-Qaeda central, bin Laden gives order and everybody else follows suit, whereas when the reality is completely different. And that was actually a very, it was almost a divorce back in 2006. So it came later in 2013, and then later on in 2014, it was really the public divorce rather than the actual.
How do we think ISIS thinks the war is going? Do they think they're winning? Do they think, would they give a similar answer to the Asher, that things are kind of stuck in the middle?
Of course, they have to say that they are winning. And I think, there have been a certain positive as well as negatives for them. I guess on the negative side, since the military campaign in Iraq, they've lost in Iraq, except for probably Ramadi in May. They've lost certain areas. They've not really expanded in Iraq. At a certain point, they look like to be invincible, as if they were going. But they did expand.
Particularly last year, right, when they were really on the offensive.
Right. Right. But they have been losing some areas in Iraq, but they have expanded in Syria. At the moment, the military campaign, particularly with the Russian involvement, one has to wonder how this is going to pan out, in the months to come. But you see, so in June 2014, they declared themselves to be a global state. So they dropped all geographical references to Iraq and the Levant, and so they became the Islamic State. And soon thereafter, they managed to get, what they call wilayat, or provinces in different parts of the world. So at the moment, we have about almost 37 provinces, including in Iraq and Syria. But having said that, except for Syria and Iraq, they're the only ones where you've got contiguous government territory. The other provinces are more, there's an area in Libya where they've got some territory, but with the others, they're more areas. I don't want to say symbolic, because they do have, they operate in some areas, but they don't have territory.
Like Peshawar, they have people, but not real estate.
Correct.
I probably don't want to push that comparison too far. I mean, Ned, it's not just a war in Iraq. The outside actors outside ISIS have become really important. the Iranians, the Syrians. I mean, to what extent, when you were sitting in Baghdad, were you and other people looking outside the borders of Iraq for guidance on what was going on with the war?
Well, at least for the Iraq, I think. I mean, ISIS. I wouldn't say that they're losing. I mean, what they managed to achieve, or the war started in Iraq, at least. It's been going on in Syria before the start of 2014, but in Iraq it really begins in the first half of 2014 with the taking of Fallujah and Ramadi gradually, because other Sunni actors were involved in that, and then when you look beyond over the next part of the year and a half, Islamic State lost areas again in Diyala province to the east, areas just south of Baghdad as well. But you're still talking about a large stretch of territory across western Anbar province, areas south of Kirkuk, Hawija, and still large sections of Saladin province. And it's very much a guerrilla war. The idea of what consists of holding territory is debatable, and they can move swiftly. So you can lose Tikrit 1 month and then take Ramadi a few months later. And
a lot of this is pretty open desert. That's really no man's land.
Yeah, and I think my point being just that ISIS is glommed on top of what in effect is an internal civil or sectarian war, however you want to define it, between the Shia in Baghdad, or Shia Islamists who are in control of the government in Baghdad, and simplistically disenfranchised Sunnis. And so ISIS has been able to manipulate that conflict to be the dominant player on the Sunni side, because they're ruthless, relentless, will do whatever it takes to impose their reign.
And also in part because the Shiite response has been in some cases similarly ruthlessly sectarian, right? I mean, you did a lot of reporting on the clampdown in Ramadi after the Shia took it back over. Tikrit rather.
Yeah.
And one of the most striking features is that a lot of the Sunni and ISIS areas would rather the Shia not return because they worried they'd be killed.
Right. I mean, I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I was in Arbil the other month, and there were a lot of people coming up from Tikrit to Arbil, and there you would just hear horrible stories of people being harassed by both Shia Hashid and their Sunni proxies in the town, kidnappings, extortion on a daily basis. At least 6 people kidnapped between late August to mid-September from the town of Tikrit. So there's really no law there. And that's problematic. So what does victory mean if the town itself, there is no law, let alone the conditions are so bad living-wise because of the fighting, damage to infrastructure? It's a real problem just for the state itself to reassert itself in any meaningful way. And when we say the state of Iraq, what do we mean if in effect you really do have on the ground a civil war between two sides, and you have all the regional players getting involved in that? The Iranians by funding different Shiite paramilitary groups or players within the system, and similarly Gulf states or Turkey.
Well, I was actually with the Iraqis when they went to a victory because during Ramadan, post-Ramadan, the security forces had completely collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
Many divisions within the security forces were non-existent. Mm-hmm. A lot of instability within their security forces, lost out on basic infantry skills, commanders not too good. So there was just destabilization among the security forces itself. So here they had to not only rebuild their security forces, but at the same time fight against a threat. That's like trying to fight someone with a broken leg, because you've lost some part of your organs or many parts of your body, pretty much. So when they won, it took them a while to win something, knowing that their security forces need a lot of help. I mean, it's in a way dysfunctional.
But I mean, to what extent is the fighting that matters being done by the Iraqi security forces, and to what extent is it being done by these extra elements, the Shia militia, the groups that you have less direct command and control over through the government in Baghdad?
Well, in terms of overall, the Ministry of Defense kind of is the main squeeze in this as far as command and control for everything. But behind all of it, they have to achieve political stability in order to counter ISIS. Like, for instance, if if you're not getting along with the Sunni groups out in Al-Anbar or the Kurds, then there's no way you can ultimately defeat ISIS. So maintaining unity among the three, I think the country itself is learning more and more. That's the only way we can ultimately defeat ISIS.
And is that a process the US can help kind of force, or is it just going to have to happen locally?
It's going to have to happen locally, honestly.
But do you think it is?
To a certain extent, as they see that the threat, in order to defeat this threat, we have to work together. Like, for instance, one concept that popped up while I was out there is to try to get more of the Sunni tribal groups as part of the National Guard, which they don't have, and they wish they had, as far as maintaining internal security. So that's one way to kind of have Sunni tribal groups to work with a Shia-led government. So that's
I'm going to take that as a US, not to a certain extent, because if a Brit said something was happening to a certain extent, that would be understatement for not in a million years. I mean, do you think, does that fit your understanding then?
Well, I think it's part of the broader problems that I think we're both referring to is the need for, I think that the different communities in Iraq have very different definitions of what it means to be Iraqi and who should be in charge. And because there has been so much war over since 2003, including what began in Anbar in 2014, it's very, this country in many ways is fragmented. The power of the government is incredibly weak. The dissolution of the military or the divisions abandoning en masse after the fall of Mosul, it's made it very hard for the government itself to actually have a functioning and effective arm of the law. So we talk about the need for Iraqis to see themselves as Iraqis. The problem is that amongst the elite themselves, they can't agree upon it. They're competing amongst themselves within their own communities about who should be in charge. On top of that, there's so much corruption. And then you're talking about, well, what would bring the Sunnis on board? National Guard or enabling local Sunni defense forces or Shia defense forces, which is a piece of legislation that's been sitting in effect since Prime Minister Abadi his government was established in September 2014. It hasn't been passed because there's no agreement. The sides are all in sort of a fight, a political war over who should be in charge. The Shia amongst themselves, and this is a football for them to fight about, and the Sunnis too. And then on top of that, you have all these other pieces of legislation that in theory would be needed to bring the Sunnis on board, ending the de-Baathification laws that forced many people who were technocrats, Shia as well, from government, finding ways to bring back the old army officers. We're talking about problems that have been festering for over a decade, and none of the sides can agree about how to address these issues. So even though right now there are some encouraging signs in a place like Anbar of recruiting tribesmen to fight in the Ramadi campaign, you're talking at best around maybe 10,000 people who've been trained, and it's not that many. Armaments are a problem in terms of who will provide the arms, the quality of them, because of corruption issues in the area. And the fact is, most Sunnis are still sitting on the fence because there's no clear sign that any major political package is being put on the table that would somehow bring the Sunnis back in a meaningful way. For many of the Shiite Islamists who are in the government, they fear that if too many people are brought back in, it will lead to a coup. The distrust is so great. There's just so much suspicion. It makes it very hard to have any movement on a meaningful political reconciliation. So that leaves you with kind of Shiite Islamists jockeying for power in Baghdad, in southern parts of the country, a fight over who has the supremacy of being the arm of the law. Because the military is so weak now, most young Shia men would prefer to join the militias, which are seen as braver and less corrupt, than join the army. And amongst those groups, you have all the different militia leaders vying for control, and then, quote unquote, moderates like Hyder Abadi. So the situation's incredibly messy and fragmented, and that leaves you with the question of, well, how do you defeat ISIS? Is it possible to? The way it is now, they'll be able to hold their ground in areas like Anbar and parts of Saladin and Nineveh for time to come until there's some sort of consensus. Anyway, I'm sorry.
The main areas that were captured back from IS were by the Iraqi army, many of which actually was an alliance or coalition with the PMU, which are the Shiite militias, and so or by the Peshmerga, which is on in different areas. So, you know, if you were an Arab Sunni in Iraq, it's and true, Abadi is doing his best, and there are, as you said, encouraging signs, but they continue to see that, you know, Iran has got quite a lot of influence in the country, and they see the Iraqi army as mostly a Shiite militia.
And I mean, if we go across the border into Syria, you've got an even more catastrophically failed state, right? Which also plays into the ISIS narrative.
It does. It does. I mean, it's actually, you know, ISIS also contributed to what happened in Syria, and in fact, they really, you know, the split that started in April 2013 when what used to be called the Islamic State of Iraq, that was launched in 2006, when they declared themselves to be the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant by merging that Iraq group with Jabhat al-Nusra, and 2 days later, Jabhat al-Nusra said thanks, but no thanks. You know, that really created a major split on the Syrian landscape, and the divisions on the Syrian landscape was actually quite a result of those who actually sided with IS versus those who sided with Al-Qaeda, with the leader with its leader Ayman al-Zawahiri, who actually took sides. And so, but I think we are seeing, or we saw something rather interesting in Syria the past year in terms of the militant groups, which was really for a very long time, we had many militant groups in Syria that were more concerned about their ideological stance. They may have cooperated militarily on the ground, but you know, there were issues in terms of some of them being part of certain coalitions and others choosing not to. But something happened this year, which is in March, which is the debut of what is called Jaysh al-Fatah, which is the Army of Conquest, where you had, that started in March, and in the northern part of Syria, you had 7 different groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra and various other groups that, you know, they didn't form a coalition, but they formed this arm, if you like, a military arm that started to cooperate with each other and started to move against the forces of the regime. And they did manage to take Idlib, I think around April, and that was a serious achievement, and I think that really. And they took other parts, just as Shawur and others. And then in June 2015, they started a new Jaysh al-Fatah in the south, in the southern part, with about 8 different groups also forming part of an alliance. Now, what they were doing is that they were actually capturing territories from the regime and having some kind of not governance, but you know, they were controlling it, and they were providing administration without getting into any of the ideological debates. And so when they formed the one in the south, which is obviously not too far from Damascus, that might have caused a bit of concern to the regime when you have these militant groups willing to cooperate militarily with each other. I mean, a few days ago, one of them split from Jaysh al-Fatah for ideological reasons, but maybe because of the Russians.
It is all the People's Judean Front. I mean,
right.
I mean, actually, I just want to throw at you. I mean, how much, if the US is kind of doesn't have the ability to dictate what happens in Iraq, it has even less in Syria, right?
Well, in terms of the recent development of Russian airstrikes occurring in Syria, it definitely changes the dynamics in Syria for U.S. strategy or the coalition strategy in Syria. We don't, again, Syria, we don't have boots on the ground. We're doing advise and assist for any security forces, so it's definitely different. Only type of influence we have in terms of military is through airstrikes. Now, in terms of Russia's intervention, which I think is very interesting, I think it's a way to prep the battlefield for al-Assad politically, knowing that the parliamentary and presidential campaigns are coming up. So as a result of that, he can gain some sort of political legitimacy and claim that, and Putin can say, hey, this is why he stayed.
Narrative as well, right? I mean, if you what there's a great phrase from British. And he's very much a master of narrative, and once the Russians put their weight behind Assad, a betting man or woman might put their money on Assad winning, which kind of changes the dynamic within the country, right? And I guess ISIS had the narrative with them, certainly for the first half of 2014 when they took over 2 countries in the space of 6 months. That's been now kind of reversed back. The moving part in it all now is the Russian involvement, right? America's as far in as it wants to go, more or less. No one really knows how far Russia will kind of push things. I mean, how does that feed into Iraq then? I mean, how present were the Russians in Iraq before things ramped up in Syria?
Well, I'd be curious about Asha's opinion on that, because they've had these, I think, intelligence gathering centers for several months, even before it became public.
Yes.
So you might actually, do you have more information?
Of course, there's intention going on between the Iraqis and the Russians.
It's been going on for how long?
I'm not sure if it's been long. I will say that it does complicate or convolute operations on ground as far as the Iraqis maintaining current operations with the coalition, and then separate ops with the Russians and the Iranians. So it's definitely quite not as clear cut between the two, and it has potentials to kind of conflict. But I think what scares me the most is definitely Russians and Iraqis agreeing that if you need airstrikes, here we can provide that in Iraq. I think that is just a big no-go, especially for current operations where we have boots on the ground doing AA, Basmaya, Taji, in Baghdad and Erbil. I think that definitely complicates current ops in Iraq. So USG right now is definitely pushing for that not to happen, but it's up to the Iraqis. But there definitely has to be a deconfliction going on in terms of Iraq when it comes to airstrikes.
Well, it becomes a political game, I think, within the Iraqi arena. Amongst the Shia, we talk about this internal Shia political jockeying for power. The Russian involvement as soon as part of this, what Russian, Syrian, Iranian axis.
I was going to say it's a Shia Russian axis and a Saudi Sunni axis, and America used to be firmly on the kind of Sunni side of that, although obviously that fits slightly awkwardly with fighting a war against ISIS, which is the preeminent Sunni force.
Right. And as you were pointing out, the Americans are doing as much as they want to do in Iraq. And on the one hand, I think there are people around Prime Minister Abadi, and Prime Minister Abadi himself at the beginning of October, right after the Russian campaign began in Syria, made clear, he said publicly, I think on France 24, how he felt that the Americans were not doing enough to help him win, and that he was open to more Russian involvement. Now, the message has been given to him clearly by the U.S. military. We do not want you asking for Russian involvement, Russian airstrikes. But where he is, not only does he probably feel, I'm pretty sure he feels the Americans are not doing enough to support him in winning the war, and also in promoting his own agenda as a moderate Shia politician in competition with more pro-Iranian hardline Shiite parties and militias. So he wants more U.S. involvement. Conceivably, he can use the threat of bringing the Russians in to possibly get the Americans more involved. Also, the Shiite paramilitary groups and parties that are anti-Abadi and closer to Iran, they do want to see Russia coming in, or they're saying it, and they're using it in part because they feel this serves their interest in battlefields where the Americans are reluctant to assist Shiite paramilitary parties, but also because maybe it embarrasses Abadi, and that they see that as in their interest, because they see Abadi as America and Britain's men.
But really, how does the Russian involvement play into the kind of jihadist narratives of the region? Because everything that's come out of AQ and before, since the end of the Cold War, America has been the great Satan that intervenes And there wasn't really anyone else knocking around in terms of external actors aside from the Brits. You just looked like a smaller, weaker version of the same thing. Now you've got another creature knocking around.
That's what makes it great saving from everyone from Hawaii. No, but it's not that they've had any nice words. No, there have been actually in recent weeks stronger rhetoric against the Russians from the jihadis. They were never. I mean, let's remember that the war that many jihadis went to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union and Russia at the time. So it's not as if they have any kind of favor.
And the Chechen war was been going on for most of the last 2 decades.
Precisely. So there's been quite a lot of involvement there, but it is true that the U.S. has got the lion's share in the U.S. in the jihadi rhetoric. But I think also let's not forget that the jihadis aren't just about the U.S. or Russia and so on. Their main targets and the people that they loathe most are actually the leaders of Muslim majority states. They're Muslim leaders. They're the ones. So it's they don't. It's not a question of
Which has always been what the West doesn't get, right?
That's right.
I mean, yeah, if you look at half the ISIS coverage that comes out of the city, the only question is, does ISIS want to blow up a nuclear power plant somewhere on the Delaware River? Which is a long way down ISIS's list of priorities. They're really about taking over the Middle East.
Right. Beyond the if you want to go for what the leader of IS at the moment wants, he wants to conquer Rome. So he wants everything as far as he's concerned. So.
But classic AQ IRA style terror attacks in the West are not the top of their list of priorities as far as at least strategically speaking.
I mean, it's not a very easy answer. There's no easy answer about this because the leaders are happy to encourage people to take up their kitchen knives and do operations in the West. So it's not and they made that very, very clear. The spokesman of IS, Muhammad al-Adnani, has made that clear on a number of occasions. So they're happy for the believers, according to them, those who believe in the same ideology as IS, they're happy for them to take up the fight in the West. So they wouldn't mind that. Do they have intention to mount certain operations in the West? I really don't know. But I can say is that what was interesting is that they've been carrying out operations in different parts, including in Yemen, where the AQAP, which is supposed to be the strongest regional Al-Qaeda group, has been active that much. And not long ago, in October, IS carried out 2 operations within a short time of each other. One against the Saudis and the UAE, and they managed to get several people killed from the coalition led by the Saudis. And soon thereafter, they mounted another operation against the Houthis.
Yeah,
so
they're a credible force in Afghanistan as well, right? I mean, we're not as credible as the Taliban, but they didn't used to exist there.
That's right. They've got their Khorasan province over there. Yes.
And I want to open this up to questions in a second, and probably take it off the record. But I mean, what's your? I mean, these groups only ever enjoy a certain amount of period in the sun, right? I mean, Al Qaeda were the top dog for 20 years, give or take. Now they face some challenges. I mean, what do each of the panels see as the kind of fundamental weakness of ISIS? What will eventually cause them to be replaced by something else, and what might that be, at least within the region? I mean, Ned, what's your thoughts? What would it take to move on from ISIS in Iraq?
It's a great question. I think, perhaps a split amongst the leadership. Baghdadi and others at the top, disagreements, or the death of Baghdadi would lead to someone else creating a new state. That would be my initial thought. Or if there is real defeats or setbacks we haven't seen in terms of the loss of territory, maybe that would feed. Because these are local, at least to an extent, at least in Iraq, it's very much a local conflict with the banner of what the legacy of Al Qaeda of revolutionary Islamic jihadist thought grafted upon local risks, local conflicts. So there's a major change in the conflict, meaning the loss of a Ramadi or a large section of Anbar or Nineveh or a major defeat in Syria, maybe that leads to a split of another group coming out that's more radical. I'd be curious on your thoughts.
I actually
No,
agree.
sorry.
Ultimately, my sense is it will be an internal, something that is internal. I think, unlike Al-Qaeda, where it may be eclipsed, but it may not necessarily be defeated, because so long as you've got the name, whether you've got...
Al-Qaeda suffered badly when the top bloke got shot, right? I'm not sure ISIS has quite the same level of vulnerability to individuals.
I think Al-Qaeda suffered much earlier than that, before Bin Laden, probably back to 2003. But when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others of that tier were actually captured by the Pakistani intelligence, and that was actually a turning moment for Al-Qaeda. But with respect to IS, I think now that it has declared itself a global state and it is in an expansionist mode, you can measure how you can defeat it. So if it loses territory, that is a defeat. Whereas Al-Qaeda never wanted to capture territory, and that's why it may be eclipsed internally by a group like IS. This is, I think IS has done more damage to the reputation of Al-Qaeda, to the credibility of Al-Qaeda than anything else. So maybe militarily, the different military campaigns against Al-Qaeda achieved things on the ground, but not necessarily in terms of the aura of Al-Qaeda and its appeal. But IS did that. So perhaps, obviously, as I said, there could be military victories against IS because it had, it asked for it. It declared itself a state. So now it has to put up with what states could do to each other.
Which may be why they've thrown so much energy into I mean, ever since the Trojan Wars or before, we tell stories of wars through cities falling, and I'm not entirely sure. When I covered the Libya war from London, and we reported the fall of Braga about 16 times, like each version was a version of Stalingrad. Anyone's actually done one of these wars, what actually happens? 20 guys turn up in pickup trucks, and one day 25 turn up on one side and 20 turn up on the other side. The 20 run away, they fire rounds in the air, and that's actually what battles are like in a lot of these environments. I mean, certainly not all of the Iraq battles. Some of them were really, really serious, but a lot of them, people come or go, they run away. But ISIS has done very well when it's been on the rocks at grabbing Al-Nira or another city that grabs the narrative. But I mean, Asha, what do you think push it back?
Well, just being in the region at that time, when we did a comparative analysis in terms of the number of Daesh versus Iraqi security forces or the Kurds, I mean, Daesh is winning because a security force failed to perform, because they didn't have the will to perform.
Not because numbers.
Yeah, right. Or numbers or capabilities, or they dropped their weapons and ran. That's the one reason why they're winning. Now, in order to kind of defeat them, they have to find that will to do it and finally defeat them. I think that's what's going to make them less sexier to join and generate more foreign fighters to be part of the fight.
The problem, of course, is that the Iraqi security forces, look very unsexy themselves, because they spectacularly and on a number of occasions, right?
Right.
To build on what Asha said, actually, sometimes the success of IS it depends on how capable they are on their own competence or on the incompetence of their enemies. And this is where I think, their main success.
That could be the whole story of the war on terror.
Right.
Precisely.
Because the dynamics would be different if
catastrophic battle
the U.S.
Right.
The dynamics would be different if the U.S. went in during Ramadan and just did it. It would probably take us 2 weeks. But we're allowing.
Well, as did Fallujah in 2004, but still to an extent the region is still recovering from that.
Right, but the main thing is to allow the security forces in Iraq to determine their own future by performing on their own without us doing it. That's what we learned from the past in terms of intervention didn't necessarily work. We want them to do it.
I have another good question, but I'm going to throw it open to other people. Any questions?
Yes, I have.
If you can introduce yourself, just say who you are.
My name is Gladys Middle. I'm country specialist for a listing in West Africa, 4 countries, French-speaking countries from West Africa. And I want to piggybacking a little bit the intent of ISIS to be regional or have more space or expansion. And is well, you mentioned Libya. Now we know they are in Libya. And we know that Libya is very unstable. And well, as country specialists for Niger, for me, is kind of concerning because we don't know exactly how serious is the relationship between Boko Haram and ISIS.
Oh, it is serious. It's formalized. They pledge allegiance, and they are now the province of West Africa. So
Because they want to have, you know, for them is that the Lakshad, around the Lakshad, is kind of a part of its territory and territoriality. It is the two things, and that I think because of that is the accident. And of course, the United States have is considering the joint force. We have the partnership. Sectarian partnership and so forth. I want to know how, you know, how dangerous can be for the region because we have already instability in Mali, for sure. Niger has been a little less stable, even though it's very close to Nigeria. There is, of course, the Chad has been touched. Cameroon already to there is a force that is already there.
I'll take one more question second, but I will. Yeah, go ahead.
Samakori. I seem to be, you know, one critically.
Where have you come down from?
Samakori, United Nations.
Okay.
Also an academic researcher. It's really interesting narrative here. That magically insurgency that has U.S. occupation. Why are we describing it as a and there Iraqis are fighting
many foreign fighters. Well, if you want to think in terms of the founder of the group, he was actually Jordanian. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was Jordanian. He's the one who actually founded the group. He started in Afghanistan. He set up camp in Afghanistan after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. He moved through Iran, not with the collaboration of the Iranians because he lost many of his men, and went to Iraq, to the north, and he set up his own militant group in Iraq. And
one of many militant groups.
Pardon?
One of many militant groups. I mean, I remember the Washington Post was reporting that.
That's right. But at the same, sure.
Zarqawi was basically enhanced his reputation as standing by the Pentagon in of itself. So the Washington Post. So to split the Iraqi resistance.
I mean, I wonder whether these are two sides of the same question because
I think it's two sides.
Yeah.
I think I'll just be really brief and I'll hand it back to you. But I think it's like a confluence of events of radical jihadist ideology being, whatever you want to say, grafted upon a sectarian or civil war of people who are alienated, meaning the broader, simplistically, the broader Sunni population in these areas in Anbar, Nineveh, Saladin. Provinces, areas.
But this is where I want to tie it back into back into the West Africa thing before we throw it back to the question slightly. I mean, if you're looking at Nigeria and Boko Haram, the problem in Nigeria is fundamentally that Boko Haram is strong. Boko Haram didn't become that much stronger by doing a deal with IS. I mean, but it gave you a broader, same reason that I started a think tank in 3 cities rather than 1. It's once you've got a global franchise, it gives you an element more kind of plausibility. And whereas in reality, yeah, who controls insert town name here, whether you're talking about somewhere in Niger or Syria or Iraq, is probably going to come down 60, 70, 80, 90%, depending where you are, to the local factors, and the rest is going to cover it, right?
So that's actually one, if you want to look at it in terms of the strength. And yes, you're absolutely right in terms of, yes, that will give them this symbolic expansion and seeming strength. But potentially it could also be a liability, because they would be at the mercy of that local factor. So if Boko Haram were to decide that somehow they need to shift gears within Nigeria and decide to negotiate and so on, if they make certain changes, then they're going to become a liability to IS.
But is anyone in Nineveh going to care? You know, I mean, really, I mean, to me, the ISIS Boko Haram deal seems like a kind of, I mean, I don't get the impression that someone's sitting in a bunker somewhere in Iraq telling Boko Haram what to do, or vice versa. You know, as long as they're both winning, it's fine. But if Boko Haram could still be Boko Haram if ISIS died on a beach, and if Boko Haram, did a deal with the Nigerian military tomorrow, we wouldn't necessarily weaken ISIS that much.
I'm not so sure about this, because what we seem to have had actually with IS is that it did what Al Qaeda couldn't do, its ability to centralize things. And so they've not really admitted any group to become a province of IS without actually centralizing their media. So the media of all these various groups, their media outlets, is actually connected to IS. So at this point, and it took a while, they did flirt for quite a bit, Boko Haram and IS. And at a certain point, I wasn't even sure whether Boko Haram wanted to have its own caliphate. So, but they did end up pledging allegiance, and they were accepted. Who benefited more from whom, I don't know. I mean, you could say that both of them did, but because at the moment now IS is into counting. You can measure how many provinces they have and how many they might lose. If they start, we still haven't lost any. Well, they haven't. Sorry, they haven't lost any.
You can also play it also allows, because there are two metrics, right? And this is the great thing about being an organization. You can lose effectiveness in one, but then you just have to add another. And you said you've got a new province. Okay. So yes, okay, IS loses out in Niger, but that's okay because we'll add a franchise, very, very small, in insert country here. So what IS has been very good at is making sure that whatever's actually happened, and it's always 60% good, 40% bad, that this is where the media ops are very, very effective. And I want to come to Asher in a second, because you could argue the US military is catastrophically ineffective in this regard. But IS has been very good at looking at a world where it's a very mixed picture and making sure that everyone looks at the one thing that they want everyone to look at this week. So, in reality, half a dozen things are going on, half of them good, half of them bad, but we're going to make sure everyone notices that we've taken this town, or we've launched this attack in Tunisia or whatever, and they're very good at focusing on the positive. And I don't get the feeling that the US military is quite so great at that, Asher.
As far as?
Well, I mean, the US military is great at, but it's not, I mean, the Western systems by their nature are good at focusing on the negative, and that if you blow up 4 American soldiers in insert country here, that is immediately the top line of the Pentagon briefing or whatever. And the fact that ISIS may have pulled out of a corner of Iraq gets relegated to paragraph 27. I mean, Ned built the narrative of this war, on a daily basis. I mean, I get, which narrative was stronger and easier for you to kind of, the narrative that the US and the Iraqi government are pushing, or the ISIS narrative?
I don't know if it's which was easier, but I think the ISIS is very good at pushing its message in a way that's incredibly flashy. Their videos, their movies,
Their magazines,
all of it, Twitter, what have you. I mean, there were times in Iraq where if I wanted to know the battlefield, ISIS against as opposed to the Iraqi government, authors or the State Department, in terms of, well, we did this here, ISIS, it doesn't resonate. It actually probably feeds the narrative of ISIS of what's power is
Oh,
I want to let Asher jump in a second.
Issues in foreign countries, it seems to be the big issue.
Asher now realizes that she's managed to become the punching bag for all Western foreign policy on the panel, but we go on.
It doesn't resonate because I think your attention's more on ISIS and their great information warfare, which was part of, the operations. The information warfare was huge as far as Twitter, YouTube, recruiting people on YouTube, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the issue here is that when we report airstrikes, like you said, there's some sort of view on it being more imperialistic, but it, to a certain extent, it does give an effect to it. But I think in terms of ISIS information campaign is so powerful, I don't think that's a way of downplaying the airstrikes that are occurring there. There's positive and negative effects to it, but it's definitely an important piece of as far as countering the threat and allowing the Iraqis to win some of the key areas.
But you also talk much about generally like standing up and map to say that we need to take our targets in these 3 towns, and they generally don't like saying, well, we've inserted 30 special operators and we hope to hell that they don't get executed by the local population, but it might work.
You talk to most not generalists, other Sunni democracy, the Americans are
Oh, of course. There's
What do they mean? What do they mean by that? What do they think they mean?
They'll take out a list and show you a list of allies are convinced that the U.S. is backing and helping ISIS. Or I think anything substantive on the ground, whereas ISIS is able to deliver
culturally, they'll say they always do that. They'll even tell you to your face. They think you just supported Daesh. So that's just a cultural thing. But really,
it's not really a cultural thing. This is really, as somebody who actually lived in the Arab world and thought that the U.S. government is really the world power, and it is so very calculating and could not make any mistakes. You end up thinking that the entire world is run by Americans. It's only until you get to meet people in USG and realize the incompetence that is at play, this is all of a sudden this becomes completely different. This is where conspiracy theory ceases to make sense. So it's not anything cultural, but the expansion of IS, it seems to be so invincible. So if you are a local Iraqi, don't blame them if they were to say, surely they can't do it by themselves. So I don't think it is a cultural thing as much as an admiration of US power. They don't think that the US could make mistakes, and they don't think that a group like IS, who came near annihilation in 2007, 2008, could actually.
But there's a fine line here too that most people don't understand or don't know unless you're part of government or anything like that. Exactly. A lot of these key players or people within Iraq come to the United States all the time for help. But if you don't perform to a certain standard or do as much as they want, that's when you'll see that there's a complaint.
I'm going to throw in a quick observation. But otherwise not dissimilar to the ISIS war. So, and I think there's a strength to the ISIS Tamil Tiger narrative that we massively overstated in Sri Lanka. So they were blowing up stuff in the capital. They controlled a huge chunk of territory. They had lots of money, which meant millions of dollars, because no one in the world understands what actual numbers mean, and millions of dollars is regarded as the same as other amounts of money. And the government was not, by and large, going, and when the government did something, it was airstrikes, which were bad because they killed civilians. What the government eventually did, just went on the offensive for 3 years and made the rather spectacular point that if you are a government and you can raise $250 million by issuing a bond, then if you're a terrorist group that can sell a bit of oil or do a bit of drug dealing, or the various, the non-negligible bits of fundraising that groups like the Tigers and ISIS can do, and they're probably the two most successful, outside far the three most successful fundraisers of militant groups in history. It's just not the same as being able to turn up on Wall Street saying we're a country, we have shed loads of oil, would you like to lend us some money at 15%? And because people will do it. There's an imbalance between, which is why I suspect that Assad will end up winning in Syria, because at the end of the day, he has a UN Security Council seat, UN General Assembly seat at least, that he has a vague access to. He has a big godfather who has a really big army, and at the end of the day, nobody, unless somebody else can become the government of Syria, then he's the only game in town. The government of Iraq is the government of Iraq. It's probably not going to collapse, right? And if it's not going to collapse, it's going to endure. That's quite a powerful thing. But I want to take some more questions anyway, and we'll, go for it. You can just introduce yourself.
I'm reason for Assad's I was wondering if the panel could go into more detail two specific elements in the conflict. One is the former, I think this de-Ba'athified Iraqi army officers that are what their dynamic hierarchy, or if that's overstated or not, or I don't know. But if you could explain a little bit, and also the tribal leaders like the Dumaini clan, their role was so big in the growth of Al Qaeda, and also its weakening. What is their role in the strength of ISIS, and its weakening? If you could specifically.
Any other quick questions while we're running around?
I just want to touch upon her point when she was saying before, given the fact that they can allocate those resources right away and try to do those and Russia was willing to do that. We have the United States given what you just said, victories, the other victories.
But you have to also,
I'm sorry.
Did you say that ISIS victory came with
No,
US?
no, the US. I'm saying
with
US.
The Iraq local
Oh,
government
okay.
victories have been US dependent.
Right, right.
The only way they recaptured that territory from the local government.
One thing I would say before the US government had, the US government probably retains the ability, should it so wish, to put a large number of tanks in Kuwait and then drive them all over Iraq to occupy the country again, which would achieve, based on the last decade, half of bugger all, but be very, very expensive.
in 2011, yeah.
I want to come to the when you said the US could sort things out, could sort things out temporarily in 8-10-2, right?
Right. Daesh is not, psychologically, Daesh wants you to think that it's a big, threat, but it's gained a lot of significance because of a country that was enabled to pretty much not be able to perform. That's the reason why. If it came into a country that had a sophisticated security force, it wouldn't be successful. Now,
they are part of the country. I think that's important for us to understand that they are locals. They are Iraqis. They are fighting internally in the civil war. I think that's
and other parts of the region.
But you're actually underestimating them by saying that they are local.
I think
Yeah, they are.
Jihadis are much more impressive in terms of in a sense. No, in terms of the globalization.
Yeah.
These are guerrilla fighters. These are the same.
But you've got the flood of foreign fighters.
I'm going to shut you down.
No, but they're coming from all over the world. It is appealing to.
Shut the border off with Turkey. Or Jordan.
No, this is a different question. This is a different question. This is a different question. You need to make up your mind. This is about the local insurgency, or are we talking about foreign elements? Certainly, there are people who are locals. Yes, they are fighting that. But this is actually a group that is not just content with having a state in Iraq. They're not interested in liberating Iraq from the Americans or from others. This is a group that wants to have an Islamic State in Iraq, and they want to expand. They don't want borders. They're not looking for a seat with the United Nations.
You have Syria.
So, sorry, excuse me. What was your name again?
Hassan.
Hassan. Yeah, I'm going to shut you down. I'm afraid. I mean, Phil, we'll carry on these conversations afterwards, but I do want to move on. On the Ba'athist influence within, I want to give that to Nelly and Ned.
Right.
So I think the demarcation has actually meant that many Iraqis were put out of the system. Not just actually Arab Sunnis, but also Shiites and so on. And that really was the turned post 2003 Iraq into a much weaker anti-political entity. Now, for a while after Zarqawi began to operate in Iraq, you had many of these groups that were actually insurgents, and they came under Majlis Shura al-Mujahideen at a certain point in 2005, 2006. But many of them were actually very much annoyed with Zarqawi and started splitting precisely because of his global agenda and because of his sectarianism and so on and so forth. After Zarqawi was killed in June 2006, his successors, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi and Abu Ayyub al-Musri, these two actually succeeded him, particularly Abu Umar al-Baghdadi. In some of his earliest speeches, he called on the Ba'athists to rejoin, but he wanted them, to just be, Islamic and so on. And so it is very, we don't have numbers, there have been reports. However, what you can say at the moment is that the ability of the group to engage in governance at this very, very, at this level of speed, in terms of, since it declared itself a state, and its ability to govern has to do with the fact that there may well have been people who are experienced in the Ba'athists, amongst the Ba'athists who are actually working and operating with IS. But I mean, this is I know that Abu Umar al-Baghdadi appealed to them, and there have been reports in terms of what they are saying about this. It's not, they're not calling that we are the Ba'athists, obviously, but it wouldn't be surprising at all if those elements are actually now helping out.
I'm going to start wrapping these up in a second. The last questions.
Yes. So I was wondering, in terms of Iraq's expansion outside of Iraq and Syria to other countries within the region, did you have a sense of their timetable, a sense of urgency on that? Are they too tied up right now?
It's a great question. I'm going to take another question as well.
My question is similar to in the same line.
Excellent.
What I wanted to ask was ISIS in particular. You just mentioned that it's more symbolic when they expand franchising, as you call it. But do you think that, as compared to Al-Qaeda, they are trying to do anything that's within the land connections? Wherever they can reach the land, they won't have to cross over the sea much. So does that also say that down the line they do not have sufficient wealth or resources to carry the fight over 10, 15 years or so? So increasing the franchising would enable them ultimately to.
Great question. Does anyone have a desire to say anything off the record instantly before? No, fair enough. We'll keep it on the record in that case. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, the first question we'll give to Asha for the sake of argument. I mean, what's your take on the expanding? Yeah, expand. Do they have a timetable for expansion?
As far as being in the Gulf region, among the GCC states, it's definitely an effort that the GCC states are trying to counter. There have been some tactics where Daesh has pretty much tried to target Shia mosques that have created some sort of concerns, and tried, the end state was to
What countries are we talking services?
Last incident was definitely in Kuwait, where you had some Daesh supporters going in from Saudi into Kuwait and pretty much targeted a Shia mosque in Kuwait.
Bahrain, is it Bahrain?
And Bahrain also too, but definitely Kuwait first and then Bahrain. So that is something that was you would say attacked it, but not necessarily expanding. Now there are some terrorist cells, you would say, that are like appearing in some of these GCC states, but the internal security forces have been very committed to counter or detect any of those terrorist cells and try to arrest those people that are part of that alignment. So that is something that they're trying to do as far as an effort. But what I think is very interesting as far as them targeting Shia in the Gulf region itself, what I thought was very interesting, especially in Bahrain and Kuwait, in response to that, you've seen where the Kuwaitis or people in Bahrain have some sort of Sunni Shia love front that they build, so showing that, hey, you're not going to be able to do that to us, because as a result, we still do get along, which does exist in that region. Unfortunately, a lot of people think, I think the overrated piece of the Sunni Shia thing is just way out of, is a political tool that sometimes, they use to kind of beef up a fight. So that's one thing. I don't see it as far as expansion, but I definitely see kind of like in the U.S. a little, where there's some terrorist cells within these countries, and their internal security forces are definitely trying to target them.
May I refine the question that I asked a little bit? So the thing that I'm interested in is, to me, Daesh is infinitely more interesting than AQ, and I have really been worried about this since 2004. I agree with you, 2003 is kind of the watershed. So what's interesting about Daesh is that they are almost like a means to growth. They're infinitely scalable, and they're kind of nimble and agile in a way that AQ never was. Two completely radically different philosophies of approach. Can they continue with that nimble strategy once they move out of their very strong base within Iraq and Syria?
Can I throw it to Nelly first?
I've been wrong about this before, and I suspect that my response is also going to be wrong. I think it's difficult to sustain. That ability is difficult to sustain. And I think, earlier on, I want to come back to a point that Peter said earlier about, it doesn't really matter if they lose Boko Haram. I do think it matters, because I think the success of IS is because of its success. And I think people are excited because they think that God is fighting on their side. That's why they're getting people from different parts of the world. And they think that these victories are precisely because of their abilities to do the things that they are able to accomplish in seemingly miraculous ways. But we are talking about the incompetence of their enemies much more than their own capability.
But with like Boko Haram or even Afghanistan, right? We're talking about local insurgencies or terrorism, whatever we want to call it, and you are able to put the black flag of ISIS up. And what is the benefit that one gets from it? What is the benefit or the gain Boko Haram really gets from by pledging fealty to the Islamic State? Are they getting more revenue? Is it?
It became an important brand at the moment. But be assured that once they've got the Islamic State flag, they cease to be a nationalist. They cease to be a nationalist and local. They will have the obligation to send fighters if the Caliph wants them to send fighters to fight elsewhere or to do other things for IS.
But Boko Haram was Boko Haram well before they were an entity. They were on the map. So what did they get? I mean, what did they get for themselves that's beneficial?
If it only was very, very short, because I want to start wrapping this up.
What we're talking. There's no infrastructure. There's no command and control. That's it.
No. By virtue of pledging allegiance, it doesn't mean that you become an IS. You become an IS when IS declares that they've accepted you into the fold. This has been the process. Let's not underestimate what it means.
I can tell you exactly what that means. No, I can tell you exactly what it means, because I run a structure that I now realize bears an alarming resemblance to it. Let's look at the PS21 model. It's actually it's really. And the simple fact is that it works because I sit at the beginning. I can control and deselect who becomes an affiliate, which means to an extent I can choose my own narrative. So if people are becoming successful, then I can make them a PS1 Global Fellow, and then I can get something on the website. They will do something. It's actually remarkable, which is how I've managed to create not quite a global institution, but something that looks bloody like one. relatively easily, because you don't have command and control over what people do, but you retain command and control over the branding of how they act up to a point. And that's actually a really powerful model. It's very cheap. It's probably not, it has massive weaknesses and it's completely knackering because you end up running a bunch of people at distance. However, if you don't really care what they're doing most of the time, that's more or less okay. And it means that when they achieve something that they want the world to shout about, so if you're a random Islamist group in Tunisia, for example, then you have the whole, you have the bullhorn of ISIS to say, look, whereas otherwise it would be a small tribal militia took this village in Libya. I mean, Fox News is never ever going to care.
So why not report it that way?
Because, well, firstly, I don't think. I mean, then
we're making our
okay. It's a different question. If I put you back in Iraq 2 years ago, and they made you report the war again, what would you do differently? What do you think we got wrong about shaping the narrative as it happened? Because it's always difficult. What do you think overwhelmed you too much at the time that was noise but not important, or the other way around?
Well, I think that there's always things that can be. I suppose everything can be improved upon. But I do think that with the war and the thrust of the war, you have the central tension, like with Boko. I think the Boko Haram question is fascinating, or in Afghanistan, where you have ISIS, an ISIS chapter now, is what does ISIS bring to the table that the local actors don't already have? What are they getting from it? Because I've looked at it very much from an Iraq-centric viewpoint. And in Iraq, the lesson that I've taken, and maybe it shapes my lens too much, is that, when this really started, and I don't think I conveyed this in speaking here, but when this really started at the beginning of 2014, it was not an ISIS insurrection. ISIS was a player, but it wasn't the only player. Even in June, when Mosul and these other towns fell, they were a major player on the ground, but there were other Sunni insurgent groups that were very active. So it wasn't the sudden march of ISIS across central Iraq. It was ISIS with these other groups that they then outmaneuvered because they were the fiercest, because of their foreign fighters, because of their Iraqi leadership, the combination. They were the ones who were willing to do by any means necessary what it took to win and to play upon the divisions amongst the other Sunni groups. So I think that's important to remember now, because during that, these visceral images of the black flags being raised, the reality was that it was a combination of different groups that were rising up, and ISIS became the most effective one. I think that's useful now in looking at the dynamics.
It's also, I think it's going to be the final thought, and then I'm going to drag people to the pub if they so wish, and I need to after that. I remember writing a story at the very beginning of 2014, which was with Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda had just taken Fallujah.
But I would even debate that.
But the point is, obviously they hadn't, because they were the guys being out called IS, but IS was part of the Al-Qaeda franchise, and then a couple of weeks later, Al-Qaeda kicked them out. Had Al-Qaeda not kicked ISIS out when they did, I wonder whether we would now be talking about the rebirth of Al-Qaeda, which is one of these great branding missed opportunities, in which ISIS would be a subordinate brand.
We got Al-Qaeda completely wrong for a very long time.
We always have.
Since 2006, we got it completely wrong. One of the most, I happen to be the lead author of the report that accompanied the release of the declassified documents from Abbottabad. And one of my favorite lines by one of the letters of bin Laden, he is telling one of his associates, Atiyatullah, he says, I'd like you to write a letter to these regional jihadi groups and ask them that they cannot really act without our own permission, and are not allowed to release anything to the media without our own permission, after having said that they've become a liability to Al-Qaeda and the jihadis. And he says, you know what? I would like to put a model like that I read about in the newspapers. In the newspapers, I have come across this expression called Al-Qaeda Central. I would not object to calling this new entity that we would create as Al-Qaeda Central. That was in late 2010. There was no such thing called as Al-Qaeda Central. When everybody was thinking and reporting that bin Laden was calling the shots, bin Laden was actually weeping at how unprofessional these various regional jihadi groups were about. So for a very long time, we've gotten Al-Qaeda wrong. And we looked at all these regional jihadi groups through the lens of Al-Qaeda, and we call them affiliates when actually we should have been talking about the disaffiliates of their essential one.
I think that was purposely done by the United States government and the intelligence.
Perfect. I think
not because Michael Schur, for example. Was
can I give you another example? There is one person in this room who will not become a PS21 Global Fellow because I can't control what he says and he goes on. No, but that's my. I think you're a great guy, but I don't want to be responsible for you. That's my kind of. That I think means that I now understand both my organization and Al Qaeda slightly better than when I started this conversation, which I feel is a good point at which to end it. Thank you very much indeed. I think that's been a really great discussion. Yeah, I mean, you guys are three of the very best people on this, which is why I asked you to be here. I think the first time I spoke to you was after you'd done the Bin Laden documents, and there aren't that many people who've read and internalized lots of the writings of Bin Laden. So that, you've been on the top of my list since then. Asher, great insight into a war that you did last year and don't appear to have won. And Ned is a harried, harassed, and ultimately evicted Reuters correspondent, which is something to which I invariably identify greatly. But plus, while we have a very diverse think tank, there's a rule that we always have to have at least a couple of balding men on each panel. Thank you very much indeed. We will be dragging everyone in the direction of a nearby, not terribly good, but hopefully at least alcohol-full pub around the corner. Thank you very much indeed. We will PS21. We will be back with other events. Thank you very much indeed.